And now recording. And just to be very punctual, let's start with this discussion series, the second one of the AI Media and Democracy Lab. So welcome everyone to our second discussion series. My name is Valeria, and I'll be moderating this event today. And the session centers around the impacts of voice AI in the future of news. And this is an important conversation for two reasons. First of all, as we have seen in the recent Reuters report, the usage of voice is increasing and new generations are turning more into audio formats. And while second, with the advances in machine learning, it is expected that disruptive innovation in the linearity of storytelling as it used to be. So there will be new experiences for the audience and new experiences for the newsroom to engage with the audience. And today I have a great panel to discuss about all these transformations and the impact that the newsroom of the future will have with new voice technologies. So before I kick off the conversation, I want to introduce the experts here. And well, today we have Sarah van der Laan. She is the Senior Digital Innovation Advisor at NPO, the Dutch Public Broadcasting Service, where she researches the potential of new technologies for broadcasting. Currently, she focuses on integrating artificial intelligence such as smart speaker to enhance a user experience. We also have Joseph Turo. He is Robert Louis Shannon Professor of Media Systems and Industries at the Annenberg School for Communication at the University of Pennsylvania. He is also an elected fellow of the International Communication Association and was presented with a Distinguished Scholar Award by the National Commission Association. His work lies at the intersection of marketing, digital media, and society. And his recent book, The Voice Catchers from Yale University Press, explores the implication of voice profiling through smart assistants. And Nicholas Diakopoulos, he is the Associate Professor in Communication Studies and Computer Science at Northwestern University. He is also the Director of Computational Journalism Lab and Director of Graduate Studies for the Technology and Social Behavior PhD program. And he is also author of the award-winning book, Automating the News, How Algorithms Are Rewriting the Media from Harvard University Press. So let me just start and kick off this conversation with a very general question and an overview of the current affairs. And well, if you can just tell me, what do you think is the current state of voice AI technologies for news consumption? And if you can give me an example of it, I would like to start with you, Sarah. If you can give me an example of how voice is working in the newsroom.
Thank you, Valeria. Okay, to give you a bit more context, at the NPO, we started exploring voice in 2017. And in 2018, we started doing some projects together with Google Home. And news was one of the first projects which we explored in collaboration with the NOS. And at that time, voice AI news was really, our transition was really from making radio till voice. So we didn't really use the strength of the medium in terms of interaction. It was very much sender orientated. And one of the lessons we learned was, in order to have impact, that the simple standard Google voices, that they didn't really were sufficient. And people love to hear more natural voices, but unfortunately that also comes with a price. And yeah, to a certain extent, it's also a sad story, because at that time we didn't really have much reach. And the curated personal stories, which we used for the Google Home, yeah, they eventually got turned down because there was too much man hours and effort. And there's also another point I would like to make regarding news, and that has to do with the role of the gatekeeper at NOS. For instance, if you now ask at your Google Home, okay, Google, tell me the latest news. Of course, we would hope that NOS news would be the first one you would hear, but unfortunately, that's not the case. It's often BNR or another provider who really updates that. And in terms of politics, We expect that in the future there will be more jurisdiction on this, and that as the Dutch public broadcaster, we hope that we will be the preferred supplier for news. But according to my information, there's a report on its way. The report is finished, but because the government is the missionary, it will take a bit longer. So that's one of the current affairs in voice news so far.
And it's super exciting to see that it's already happening. And you mentioned that you were working with Google Home, and I want to transition a bit. I was also reading the latest book of Joseph Turo, The Voice Catchers, and you clearly mentioned that there are different industries and different players in this industry of voice. And I wanted to ask you, who are the lead developers that are pushing voice AI for the media? And how do you think they will shape this media landscape with their interaction?
Well, thank you, Valeria. I didn't look specifically at journalism, but I looked at the what I call the voice intelligence industry, which is this assemblage of companies. There are companies we never heard of, like NICE. I don't know if anybody's ever heard of NICE. Then there are companies that we've all heard of, like Google, as Sarah mentioned, and Amazon. And there are many companies that are trying to work with them. One thing that Sarah just said that is actually true, and what I looked at with respect to marketers, because I looked at the interconnection between marketers and media firms, and as well as this industry that's developing. Marketers are afraid they're not going to get the right positioning in the smart speakers. That if you say, for example, aspirin or batteries, your brand is not going to necessarily show up, just like your radio station. So there's a lot of struggle around that. And some people believe that as a result, banks and other companies will create their own voice assistants for that purpose. But if I may, and maybe we can get into this in a bit, I'm concerned about some of the developments in voice. I think there are lots of fascinating possibilities and positive things, and Nick brings up in his book some really interesting developments. But there's also the issue of what happens when branding packages become important to journalism organizations in order to engage customers. What happens when in other words, a voice begins to give different news presentations to different people based on the profile that the company has about them, even if it's the same story, changing the ideological bent of the story, changing the voice tone based on what you think the person's personality is, okay? There are lots of issues around the question of in the narrative that is created based on how you think of the target audience. And as a consequence, the role of the journalist in that regard, because the journalist may give the raw material, but the computer not only will put it together, but also put it together based upon some of these discriminatory characteristics. So maybe we can get into some of that discussion down the line, but these are the sort of thing that I'm interested in.
Definitely, and well, voice profiling, right? And
Yes.
Nicholas, I wanted to ask you also in that direction. You have been doing research auditing different systems, and one of it was also in terms of Alexa. How is it, the information quality? So I wanted to ask you, what do you think is the best example that can also describe this transformation that voice assistants are bringing in comparison to other news recommenders?
Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting. And thanks so much again for including me in this conversation today. So we actually have some research that's just published today, in fact, at the Computer Supported Cooperative Work Conference, where we investigated and audited news on the Alexa device, so news-related queries, and the extent to which people were able to have their news-related queries met. And their information needs met by Alexa. And it turns out, we were kind of focused on quality-related issues with the device, things like relevance, accuracy, timeliness of the responses from the device. And provided that Alexa can give you a response, the good news is that it's mostly high quality, like 95 to 100%. accurate and timely information. Actually, the accuracy was over 99%. The timeliness was a little bit lower. Again, provided that it's relevant. You know, one of the more, I think, troubling things that we found in our audit was that actually the quality of the responses you can get can vary a little bit with the phrasing of the question. So different people might phrase queries in slightly different ways, and that might lead to subtle differences in the quality of information that you get. And also that the provenance of information is really broken with these voice devices. You know, when we ask something like Alexa a question, it doesn't usually say, according to the New York Times, blah, 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 blah.
Right.
It just gives you the answer. And what we found is mostly the answer is coming from Wikipedia. And only in something like 1% of our queries did it actually call out a news-related source for the information. And I'll give you one guess. You know, what was the most cited news organization on the Amazon Alexa? Maybe it's the news organization that Jeff Bezos owns. And so there you go. We have interesting relationships there to further investigate as well. But so that's one. I think that's one side of this whole equation, is how news gets onto these platforms. The connections between where the news is coming from, how people query for it, and so on. The other side that I'm really excited about, you know, because some of the stuff I talk about in my book is automation and how that relates to the transformation of news information onto devices like this. And we see recent experiments from companies like Shibstead looking at how to use synthesized audio, or if you're familiar with deepfakes, the same technology can be used for audio to generate voices that sound like, let's say, your main podcast anchor. You can then synthesize any article to be read in that voice. And so there are news organizations that are out there that are trying to apply these techniques to make their content more accessible. I think that's interesting. I think we still need to figure out where it makes business sense to do that, whether or not audiences want that, whether or not that, as Joe was mentioning, whether or not that creates interesting consequences in terms of credibility and believability and trustworthiness, and the degree to which we're manipulating those factors based on who is presenting the information and who we're synthesizing to present that information are all new dimensions to think about there.
Yeah, definitely. And it's still emerging, right? So it's a field that it's emerging, but there are already some challenges that we can see. And Sarah, you mentioned some challenges that you're facing on the newsroom, but I wanted to focus a little bit more. What are the key challenges that you see that are pushing back media organizations in the implementation of these technologies? Is it that the audience is not ready yet? Or is it mostly that there are some lack of skills? What do you think is the key implication right now that is pushing you back?
Ooh, well, I think one of the challenges, at least for the Netherlands, is that we are such a small language that it's really hard to get it right, our language. And in terms of the public, I actually see it as an advantage that voice is an interface and a medium, because as a public broadcaster, inclusion is for us very important. So due to voice, we can include the elderly who are maybe not as technical savvy as young people. People speak faster than they type, and we can include youngsters, kids who can't read or write yet, and they can still have our public broadcast content. So I see advantages in that respect.
So more advantages than disadvantages in that regard.
Well, it evens out on the other side.
That's also the idea, like new ways to engage with the public. And well, there are actually also new new platforms or new things that will emerge from these technologies. And Nick, also in your book, you touch upon metrics, how automation is influencing into metrics. So I wanted to ask you how voice technologies or how these platforms do you think they will impact in voice AI metrics, and if they will have any inference on the influence on creating the news?
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm not too familiar with how metrics are done in this domain, to be entirely honest. You know, we had a project with Chartbeat recently. Chartbeat, as many of you know, is a major news analytics company. I'm not aware that they have any kind of offering in the audio space, and so I think maybe the door is open there for other organizations, or maybe some of the other panelists know about metrics that are being used. But I think the question actually exposes a very important point, which is that we need to know more about how audiences are responding to this kind of content, and that could come in the form of metrics, that could come in the form of other kinds of research studies, qualitative survey kinds of studies, to really get a deeper understanding of, like, what are the contexts where this type of content is truly valuable, and where might there be an opening for commercial media to meet an information need, and so on. So of course there are some surveys. NPR, I think, has done a survey almost yearly on smart speaker devices. But I think there's more we can know about the consumption of information on these devices. Absolutely.
Yeah, and also something that you mentioned is business-wise, right? So how business-wise it could make sense or not. And Joseph, also in your book, you touch upon, well, how we can monetize on it. And right now, all these technologies are offering free content, but to some extent, right? So I wanted to ask you more in terms of how can we determine the monetization for news content? Who will determine that? And how would that influence some power dynamics between the newsrooms or the organizations, the audience on the platforms?
Well, it's actually very interesting. Again, the money that's being made in voice now is outside the public view, mostly. I don't know how many people know it, but for example, companies that run 800 numbers, there are 800 in the US, toll-free numbers, if you want to call a company to complain or something. Many of those companies now have software that analyzes people's voices when they speak to the agent. And as a consequence, the computer will actually listen to the voice, associate it with that person's buying history, and triage that person to an agent who supposedly is good with angry people or frustrated people or happy people. And that's a way they contend anyway that they actually make money off of that software. NICE is a company that's involved with this. Google and Amazon are very busy with that kind of thing too. In terms of the daily activities of making money off of this stuff, I don't think, from everybody that I spoke to, including people from Amazon and Google, they're still not making money off of those speakers in terms of what they're doing. It's a long-term idea. Car companies assume that what's going to happen down the line, particularly with self-driving cars, is that people will sit in their car and listen to sponsored media, whether it's news or entertainment, as they travel. So they're seeing voice as incredibly important in the long term when it comes to being inside the car. More and more, it's a marketing activity. You're speaking to your car, where's the nearest restaurant, where's the nearest gas station, all of that, and some companies are going to pay for it. The whole question of what the apps on sort of Alexa or Google, the Nest are going to do is a very interesting question. How do you monetize that? Some companies are charging for it, but it's still a very new world. I mean, this is just the very beginning of a very long process.
It's just emerging. And also, not to put like in terms of very negative framing, I also want to hear your recommendations, Sarah. So first of all, yeah, what do you think that journalists and newsrooms can do to benefit from all of this potential?
Well,
of this?
one of the things we should do, and it's also great that there are scholars here, is educate them to be the conversational designers of the future, because it's really a new skill which these journalists don't really have right now. So that's something they should invest in. That would be one of my recommendations. And also to have more Dutch developers who really know the technology. If you look now, for instance, at the whole voice technology in the Netherlands, there's a division between the scientists, and also they are quite scattered. You have linguists, but it should, in my opinion, it should be more interdisciplinary, where they focus on human behavior and technology. So both these aspects, so they can really reap the benefits from each other's expertise.
And can I just add one other kind of dimension to this? Because I feel like most of the conversation that's going on with respect to voice in journalism is on the distribution end of things. Mm-hmm. And I just want to step back and also suggest that maybe media could also be thinking about other applications of voice technologies which facilitate things like information gathering. So in some of my other research, we're looking into computational news discovery, how to use AI to orient editorial attention towards patterns in large data sets, which might lead to interesting news stories. But, in addition to things like discovering news, I've been thinking about activities like news gathering and how voice technologies might actually help journalists systematically gather information into databases. So for example, like if you need to automatically query a subset of businesses in your local area to ask for like a specific piece of structured information, this could potentially inform database journalism or even investigation. And you can easily imagine journalists deploying these kinds of speech technologies to make those calls, to reach out to those people and to gather that information through conversational interactions with people. But there's also really interesting intersections with these kinds of deployments with like legal issues. So in terms of like the limits to robo-dialing, to robocalling, ethical issues in terms of how to approach an information source using an AI-generated voice. Companies like United Robots, which does a lot of work in Scandinavia for automated sports coverage, automated real estate, these kinds of things, they are like kind of dabbling into this. They're doing it using SMS messaging. So like they'll send out an automated message to like the coaches after like a soccer game, and to try to get a response from those coaches that they can then integrate into their automated pipeline. But you can easily imagine taking that another step forward to actually doing that with voice.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely, and that was also part of the second question, of the last question for you, Nick and Joseph. If you can give me a big overview of ethical and normative recommendations for this emerging field that we're still working on. So yeah, if you want to start, Joseph.
Sure. Well, transparency is the most obvious part, as Nick just mentioned. How do you present yourself? That seems to me obvious. I actually, in my book, suggest that when it comes to marketing, profiling should be outlawed. I think that there are too many issues that one has to deal with, but I have no question that voice is a critically important aspect of computation and our lives moving forward. Text is so primitive when you think about it. And as Sarah mentioned, there are too many people who have problems with text. Voice is the answer in so many ways. I just think we have to be very careful to use it so that it serves the public interest rather than a certain notion of marketing that increasingly is so personalized oriented that it can get us all in trouble.
Thank you. Well, I'm gonna stop recording for now, and we're gonna transition. I see some questions. For instance, Natalie is asking, Joe, let me just stop recording.